Dr. Sarah Hensley. I'm a specialized social psychologist, and I've been studying the science of attachment and attraction inside romantic relationships for over 15 years. In this video, I want to talk about dismissive avoidant attachment. It is the attachment style that most people ask me questions about in my coaching practice. It's because their behavior can be quite baffling. So, dismissive avoidance grew up in environments where there was fairly profound emotional neglect. And what's kind of interesting about this is that the children that then grow up to be adults in these situations don't really realize that they have been emotionally neglected. Often their parents were very physically present. So parents, went to their sporting events, packed school lunches, were around and present for them in their lives, and actually would often help them solve problems. So they gave intellectual support to the children. But intellectual support is not the same as emotional support and emotional attunement. Let me give you an example. So a child who grew up in a household that went on to then develop dismissive avoidant attachment would maybe have a common issue, such as being bullied in school. And they would come to their parents and say, hey, I'm being bullied in school and it's really hurting me and I don't know what to do. The parent might jump in and say, oh, don't worry about what other people have to say. You're great, you're awesome, and just go about your merry way. Just focus on what you're supposed to focus on and don't worry about them. And some might say, okay, they were actually there and present to support the child through that problem, but really what they failed to do was attune to the child's emotional experiences. So they just jumped right into this solution that actually dismissed the feelings of that child and said, hey, just don't worry about it. Well, the child is worrying about it, which is why they came to their parents, and just don't worry about it doesn't do anything to soothe their nervous system. So an emotionally attuned parent might handle that very, very differently. They might say, oh, wow, I bet that's making you feel really sad. How else are you feeling? And they might inquire about the emotions of the child during that process and really try to search in terms of how is this child experiencing this situation emotionally, and then attend to that properly. So, wow, I would feel really sad too if that was happening to me, and then go into not just the problem-solving aspect, but the emotional regulation aspect, right? So when we feel sad, what are some things that we can do to help us feel better? Let's just sit with that emotion and let's practice some breathing through it, to see if it gets better for us. And then let's focus on our thoughts associated with what's happening and the stories we might be telling ourselves about what that means about who we are. So that's what emotional attunement looks like. And so although these well-meaning parents tried to solve the problem, really they dismissed the emotional experience of the child. So what does that do to someone as they grow, age, and mature? Well, the child still has those emotions, whether someone helped them soothe them or not. And so if they're dismissed by the caregiver and the child is sort of pushed along their merry way, what they learn to do is suppress their own emotional experience and distract away from it. Suppression via distraction is the strategy that little children develop. And they carry this strategy with them their whole lives. So as they grow up to be adults, they will inevitably continue to suppress their own negative emotion and distract their way through life. So as dismissive avoidants grow up, they learn to really lean in to things that provide them with that distraction to continue to suppress their emotions, as well as lean into things that make them feel competent and capable. Because when it comes to understanding their own feelings and the feelings of other people, they feel largely incompetent. In fact, they often feel defective, which is a big wound of the dismissive avoidant person. So what happens when dismissive avoidants get into adult relationships? Well, a number of very predictable things. They usually come in really strong in the honeymoon phase, so they can really look like a securely attached person at first. So in the honeymoon phase, in the dating phase of relationships, they can be effortful, they can be attentive, they can provide some emotional support, and they can be vulnerable with other people. But very predictably, as a relationship grows more committed and things like conflict start to creep in, and just the amount of time and expectation that is put on the table for that partner to fulfill becomes extremely overwhelming for the partner. So the dismissive avoidant person will start to feel very overwhelmed by those expectations for increased commitment, for increased time and attention given towards the person that they are dating. And so they will start to do what's called deactivating or pull back and withdraw. So the two C's, conflict and connection, are the things that predictably make dismissive avoidance withdraw after a certain level of commitment has been reached. In my practice, I see a very predictable pattern with dismissive avoidance that somewhere along the 4 to 6 month mark is usually when this behavior starts to creep in. So a lot of times dismissive avoidants don't realize that they're deactivating or pulling away. And they make a lot of excuses. Well, I'm just really busy. I let a lot of things drop when I was really, spending a lot of time with you, and now I have to catch up. And I'm sorry, but I just can't give you what you need, is often what we hear. And so this can be really confusing for the partner of the DA because the DA came in so strong at the beginning of the relationship. And so the fears that the DA has around being intimate, close, and connected have to do with their fear around vulnerability and their lack of confidence and competence in dealing with their own emotional experience and the fact that they feel extremely overwhelmed by someone else's emotional experience. To them, when someone brings emotions to the table, it feels like an attack because in their house, nobody brought emotions to the table. So they didn't really receive any modeling on how to deal with somebody else's feelings. So when someone brings feelings to the table, they get this enormous amount of overwhelm. Their nervous systems go into a flight or freeze state. They withdraw and often disassociate. This can leave the other partner feeling pretty abandoned and not seen, heard, and understood. So they essentially withdraw, they go into their turtle's shell, they begin to suppress and distract into the things, again, that make them feel competent, happy, capable, etc. And so they often don't return to conflicts because to them, that seems like, whoa, that's just reigniting another conflict. The better strategy or the safer strategy for them is really to just wait it out if they can, sort of like stay gone until it's blown over and then they try to return and act like nothing happened. So if you grew up in a household where conflicts were resolved and solved and people spoke about their feelings, this would feel very neglectful to you. It would not feel right. You would think that that person just doesn't care about you, but that's really not what's going on for the DA. What's going on is that their nervous systems are completely overwhelmed by the vulnerability, by conflict, by the expectation to be vulnerable and to understand their own emotions, which they struggle with, and to understand the feelings of someone else, which they struggle with. So the subconscious fears often really start to arise when this is happening, when there's increased connection and increased conflict. And those subconscious fears just make them want to continue to withdraw. And they can really suppress the emotions of their partner. So over time, we see a predictable cycle. They start off strong, they get committed, and then when time goes on, conflict starts to creep in, expectations start to rise, they start to deactivate, they start to prioritize themselves, and this makes the partner feel very neglected and very abandoned. They usually come in, express those emotions, and then same thing. Those emotions then cause the dismissive avoidant to continue to deactivate, and on and on and on it goes until somebody decides to break the cycle. The dismissive avoidant either leaves, the other person usually leaves, maybe they set a boundary, or maybe they just can't take it anymore. And then the DA repeats the pattern with someone else, often telling themselves a story that I just didn't find the right person. That person was just fundamentally incompatible with me. But that's really not the case. The dismissive avoidant often fails to recognize that they are inappropriately distant inside of relationships. Their key characteristics tend to be around self-directed behavior. I don't like to use the word selfish. I like to use the word self-directed because the intent of selfishness isn't there. However, because they grew up and were pushed into independence usually too soon, they kind of grew up with blinders on. So they're very focused on their own path, their own needs, and they tend to be very anxious in relationship to self. And so that causes them to be avoidant towards others. And they just can't override that nervous system activation, where they go up into that flight or freeze state and decide to push through and give intimacy and vulnerability. It's not something that can be pushed through. They have to learn the tools to regulate their own experiences around vulnerability and learn to regulate themselves during conflict. And that takes tools and it takes strategies. And those are the tools and strategies I teach in my coaching groups. I do wonderful with dismissive avoidance. So if that's something that interests you, you can see me at my website, thedatingdecoder.com. Click on book group. I would love to have you there, especially if you have a DA partner. I can really help you figure out how to learn to communicate with your DA partner, learn how to set boundaries where you can get your needs met, and learn to be able to really interact with them in a way that feels good to them and brings them peace and harmony, but also respects you and your needs getting met as well.